Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a few minutes early and I'll just take those up with introducing myself. My name is David Jones. I'm the destination lecturer on this cruise, and my task is to introduce to you and expand for you something about the places we're going to, in this case the place we've just been to, and in particular expand on the sort of things that you don't read about in the guidebooks or only briefly mentioned in the guidebooks. In this case the topic's the fall of Singapore, 1942. It was described by Churchill as Britain's greatest military catastrophe. Are there any British people here from the UK? You're probably going to be a little annoyed and quite confronted by what I have to say. I'm just the messenger. It's based on factual information which was withheld by Churchill rammed through a special act of Parliament that embargoed everything to do with the Singapore debacle for 50 years after the end of the war. Now normally even cabinet papers only have an embargo of 30 years, and everything else really in government is fair game, subject to freedom of information laws. But the lid was tight on this, and it wasn't until 1995 that very reluctantly the British archivists made available material on Singapore. Historians and researchers and scholars, of course, leapt on all of this material, and in 2000 there was a conference in Singapore to discuss all the findings from their research over the previous 5 years. And this talk is based on the outcome of that conference, and it's supplemented by subsequent material which has come to light through Japanese archives, and in particular the Japanese propaganda movie film unit that was in attendance throughout this campaign. We are sailing right now almost past a beam of Kuantan. In about 2 hours' time, 2 to 2.5 hours' time, we'll be sailing almost over the top of the wreckage of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, the two battleships that were sent out to rescue or save Singapore. My particular interest in this topic and that incident in particular is that I was born on the 10th of December 1941, which is the day those ships were sunk, and with them sank any hope of saving Singapore and put Australia in tremendous jeopardy. The second leg to my interest is that the gentleman on the left there is my father. He finished the Air Force as a squadron leader in the RAAF. On the right is his younger brother Ross, who was a flight engineer on Sunderland flying boats and subsequently Catalina flying boats. And in the middle is the oldest brother, Ivor. Ivor was with the 8th Division, Australian Division, in the Middle East. They were recalled to Australia when it became obvious the Japanese were about to attack, and the ships carrying them were diverted into Singapore by Churchill against the strongest protests of the Australian government, and Ivor's unit landed in Singapore just in time to be surrendered to the Japanese. And he spent the next 3.5 years in Changi, and there's an epitaph to that. But on to the talk. We'll start right back and trace the sort of history of errors, mistakes, bungles that led to the collapse of Singapore. And in the latter half of the 19th century, the doctrine, as it became known, of imperial defence had come to be accepted as the basis for the security of the British Empire. And it rested on several assumptions: that command of the sea through the supremacy of the Royal Navy provided the first line of defence, that the colonies and the dominions should provide such forces as were necessary to ensure defence against local attacks, and that in the event of a general war or major international crisis, that all parts of the empire would cooperate in the common cause. And the Dutch and the French and the US colonial empires followed the same assumptions. Inevitably, there were tensions between these assumptions as the British and other colonies sought a greater degree of independence from their mother countries, and priorities became much more home-centred rather than kowtowing to the far-off capitals in London and Paris and Amsterdam and Washington. However, when it came down to it, colonies such as Australia had no realistic choice but to be part of a wider defence scheme and to depend on what Australia called our great and powerful friends, the United Kingdom and the USA. In 1920, in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, a conference of senior Australian Army generals drew up a new defence plan for Australia. It was based on two assumptions. Firstly, that notwithstanding the establishment of the League of Nations, Australia's defence basically rested on its own capacity, and hopefully with assistance from the United States. And thirdly, that Japan constituted the only potential and probable enemy to Australia's security. And these proved to be remarkably accurate observations. Unfortunately, the Australian government took no notice of these recommendations, and instead at the Imperial Conference in 1923, at which Britain dictated its Singapore strategy to the colonies, Australia adopted the British edict without question. And this was despite Australia's Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, confessing that while I'm not quite clear as to how the protection of Singapore is to be assured, I am quite clear on this point that apparently it can be done. And in recognition of his obedience, Stanley Bruce was knighted by the King. From the very beginning, therefore, Australia's politicians abrogated any sense of responsibility for critical examinations of the ludicrous assumptions underlying the Singapore strategy. Belief in it became an article of faith buttressed by the fact that it enabled successive governments to save on defence expenditure, secure in the knowledge that the Singapore fortress was the answer to all problems of regional security. Those savings were even greater when Australia declined to contribute a penny to the establishment and running costs of the base. For the Australian Defence Force, it was a disaster, as it heralded a long period of government parsimony that almost strangled the Army, led to the Australian Navy being downgraded to the Australian Squadron of 3 effective fighting ships, and a brand new Australian Air Force that could not afford to train any pilots, let alone buy aircraft. Inter-service rivalries did little to enlighten the strategic debate, as each service tried to protect what little of its patch it had left. There were a few intelligent people roaming the corridors of the Defence Department. Notable among them was Colonel John Laverack, who in 1929 told the Parliamentary Defence Committee that they severely underestimated the invasion danger posed by Japan. He specifically foresaw that Japan would wait until the British Empire was so involved in another war in Europe that its capacity to respond to a threat in the Far East would be greatly diminished. Laverack argued that when those circumstances prevailed, which he predicted would be in the next 10 years, Japan would seek to exploit British weakness by invading Australia through Malaya. In honour of this remarkably accurate prediction, Laverack was shunted aside, never promoted, and the only memorial to him is he's had a barracks named after him at the base in Townsville, in Queensland. I guess by now you're thinking, what on earth is this Singapore strategy that I keep rabbiting on about? Well, it can be summed up in just a few words. And that's pretty much it. Britain's navy was so powerful that all they had to do in the event of any threat in the Far East was to send the home fleet out there and the potential foe would run away. End of story. Levity aside, let's go back to the beginning of Singapore. In January 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles landed on Singapore Island after being sent by the British East India Company to establish a trading post in the Far East. And Raffles saw the potential of Singapore's Great Harbour, which you have seen something of in the last few days, I'm sure, and its strategic location at the foot of the Malay Peninsula. And so began the successful commercial enterprise that is today's Singapore. Singapore still basically is one giant corporation and a very successful one. From Singapore, the East India Company could control the Straits of Malacca, one of the world's busiest commercial seaways, as well as all the approaches to the Spice Islands and even Australia and the Far East. For the next 100 years, Singapore enabled the East India Company to dominate trade in the region and greatly enriched the coffers of colonial Britain. A few months after becoming First Lord of the Admiralty in 1912, Winston Churchill wrote that if the power of Britain were shattered upon the sea, the only course open to the 5 million white men in the Pacific would be to seek the protection of the United States. Churchill realised that British naval power alone made possible the regional security that it had guaranteed Australia and New Zealand. One could argue that therefore a strong and permanent fleet presence in the Far East was necessary. But Churchill's view was that the colonies should contribute to the Royal Navy's ability to control the challenge of the German fleet in the North Sea and thus maintain Britain's worldwide naval supremacy. By the end of the Great War, Britain's finances were greatly depleted, the electorate was in no mood for further expenditure on defence, and the United States was insisting on a worldwide cap on naval strength for all nations, including Britain, except of course for the United States, and Japan, which totally ignored this edict. This posed the question of how a British fleet based in home waters and the Mediterranean was to protect the Empire's interest in the Far East. It was decided to create a great naval base in the Far East, which would not contain any permanent ships, but to which the Royal Navy could redeploy sufficient forces to counter any threat in the region. There was a large element of fantasy in this strategy because it assumed that any aggressor would be accommodating enough to mount its challenge only at a time when Britain was free to respond. Of course, the most likely scenario was in fact the reverse of this assumption, but because it presented an insoluble problem to the politicians, they conveniently ignored it. Various alternative sites for the base were looked at, including Hong Kong and Sydney, but in June 1921, the delegates to the Imperial Conference accepted the recommendation of the Committee of Imperial Defence and chose Singapore. It was a sensible choice for the same reasons that made Singapore ideal for the East India Company. However, for the next 2 years, no advance was made because various government agencies argued endlessly amongst themselves as to where exactly in Singapore the base should be constructed. Keppel Harbour, which is where we were tied up, was close to the city. It was actively considered but finally rejected because it was too busy even then as a commercial port to serve as a major naval base as well. It would be an absolute disaster to mix a naval base there now. You've seen the volume of shipping. This left 4 other places dotted along the northern and the northeast coast of the island. Sembawang was eventually chosen, not for its stunning virtues so much, but because it posed fewer engineering problems, that is, it would be cheaper than the other sites in the Straits of Johor. In the Army's opinion, however, the defensive vulnerability of Sembawang left much to be desired. The major defence of Singapore was based on 2 giant naval guns, 15-inch diameter shells, a metre long, that they pushed into the air, 2 tonnes of screaming metal. But these were mounted on swivel bases that rotated through 180 degrees. They were at the entrance to Keppel Harbour, and they guarded the southern approaches to Singapore. But if only they'd put them on 360 degree swivel bases, they could have actually contributed to the defence of Singapore from an invader from the north, but that didn't happen. The Admiralty suffered from no such lack of confidence in the ability of Singapore to defend itself. In its opinion, the British government could easily send the main fleet from home or the Mediterranean waters to Singapore in time, plenty of time, to protect it from an enemy landing in Malaya. And this is the estimates over the years of how long it would take to relieve Singapore in the event of an invasion threat. And you can see how, after an initial dip, the numbers kept rising. And secondly, that the number of capital ships available to relieve the garrison were declining steadily. And it was pretty obvious that by 1939 the Admiralty were counting on getting plenty of notice from the enemy, at least 6 months, so that they could get their act into gear. The Admiralty's initial plan for Sembawang, which was known as the Green Scheme, was a grandiose construction project that, if built, would have accommodated 19 capital ships, that is, cruisers and battleships, all at once. A fleet of this size, together with their escorts, would have required that both the British and the United States navies would be combined and in Singapore at the same time. The cost would have been horrendous, so the Green Scheme was replaced with a much more modest Red Scheme, which went way too far the other way. The Red Scheme envisaged a maximum of 4 capital ships plus escorts, 1 floating dock and a single graving dock and a tiny wharf area. One has to ask why the Admiralty committed to spending £25 million on the Red Scheme when, even once the base was operational, it would only provide 20% of the minimum facilities needed to properly defend Singapore. Nonetheless, the British bravely chose neither to learn the lessons of history nor to expect the worst-case military scenario that I've mentioned, that is, fighting a war simultaneously in Europe and in the Far East, without the assets or a suitable base to do either. But things got even worse. Churchill, in his unlikely guise as Chancellor of the Exchequer in Stanley Baldwin's government from 1924 to 29, cut back even further on the already deficient Red Scheme and eliminated even the repair facilities from the limited services that were to be offered at Sembawang, and this was to prove fatal for the Prince of Wales. The ship, that is, not the fellow. The British government then committed an even more criminal act than the emasculation of Singapore. Although it was well recognised that Japan was the only credible enemy in the Far East that could be foreseen in the next 20 years, the British then proceeded to train the Japanese to defeat them. In 1920, the Imperial Japanese Navy asked the British to help develop air power. The politicians thought it was a great idea and would help increase their influence over Japan, and the British arms merchants rubbed their hands, they smelled a market, and the Royal Air Force were all gung-ho to teach those nips a thing or two. The Admiralty, to its credit, opposed the proposal. They regarded the Japanese Navy as extremely capable and a potential foe. They had no wish to make matters worse. To get around this, the politicians labelled the aid to Japan as an unofficial civil aviation mission. The mission included 19 experienced officers and 9 warrant officers from the Royal Naval Air Service. 5 officer instructors taught basic flying, while others trained the Japanese in deck landing and fighter techniques in the marine environment. Ground crews were instructed in photo reconnaissance interpretation, engine maintenance on aircraft carriers, and the development of shore-based support air bases. They took with them 113 of the latest aircraft in the British inventory, plus bombs, torpedoes and wireless equipment. The Japanese said, "Oh, can we borrow these for a little while?" And they did, and they copied them and then handed them back and said, "Well, no, they're really not what we wanted." Training commenced on the 22nd of July 1921. By April 1922, the Japanese were sufficiently well trained to do simulated attacks on HMS Renown when she entered Tokyo Harbour carrying the Prince of Wales on his world tour. No doubt this stood them in good stead when they sank her sister ship, HMS Repulse, off Malaya on the 10th of December 41. By the time the mission left in 1924, the Japanese knew everything about British tactics in the use of air power at sea. It was the British who persuaded Japan that island deck aircraft carriers were the future of naval power. The official exchange of information was augmented by the Japanese use of such men as Lieutenant Commander Frederick Rutland, who moved to Japan from his job as a naval aviator on the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle and set up permanent residence from which he provided detailed information on all elements of carrier operations. He effectively planned Pearl Harbor. Through their shrewd manipulation of the gullible British, Japan was able to pull close to the US Navy in the development and operation of aircraft carriers. By 1926, they were equal. By 1929, they were second to none. They were the first Navy to be led by an admiral who was an experienced expert in naval aviation. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy executed all the tactics that the British had taught them. Their land-based aircraft killed battleships at sea, while carrier-based aircraft sank battleships in port. The student had become the master. And so the stage was set for the Singapore disaster. Having saddled themselves with a faulty strategy, the British proceeded to compound the felony by a series of unforgivable tactical blunders that culminated in the surrender of their overwhelmingly superior force, at least in numerical terms, to a much smaller Japanese army outnumbered 3-1 that was on the brink of abandoning the attack because they had no ammunition left. The first blunder was to saddle the defenders of Singapore with a series of aristocratic fops and fools as their military leaders. Few of these men had any battlefield experience. Their skills were in the correct manipulation of a cocktail glass. and making inane small talk around the dinner table. In November 1940, the British appointed a 63-year-old airman as Commander-in-Chief Far East, with responsibility for running a naval and military army operation for which he was totally unsuited. He rejoiced in the name of Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Moore Brooke Popham, commonly known to his men as Henry. The reason for appointing an Air Force officer was that the RAF had persuaded the government that 12 squadrons of obsolete aircraft in Singapore could simultaneously replace the entire army on the northwest frontier of India and all the cruisers engaged in the defence of trade routes in the Far East, as well as representing such a threat to Japan that it would be deterred from ever attempting to launch a war in the Far East. Since this represented a far cheaper alternative to maintaining a naval presence in the region, the politicians, of course, went for it. To give Brooke Popham his due, he did accept the Army's view that the defence of Singapore depended on adopting a forward defence strategy for the Malay Peninsula, a plan which became known as Matador. The scaled-down naval base at Singapore had been finally completed in 1938 after 10 years of painfully slow construction progress. With the outbreak of war in Europe the following year, the garrison at Singapore, which contained only 8 battalions, was strengthened with a brigade from the Indian Army. The War Office increased the estimate for the time that Singapore could hold out in the event of a Japanese attack to 180 days. Operation Matador envisaged taking the battle to the Japanese, who were by now the obvious aggressor, having brutally invaded, first of all, Formosa in 1895, now of course known as Taiwan. Then they took over Korea before the First World War. In 1931 they moved into Manchuria and took over eastern China. In 1937 to 41, culminating in the dreadful rape of Nanking, the administrative capital. And in 1940, when France surrendered to Japan's ally, Germany, the Japanese went to the French colonial government and said, hand over, and in traditional French fashion, they did. Matador was aimed at achieving its aims by fortifying Malaya all the way up to the Thai border. But Brooke Popham's request for resources to accomplish this task fell on deaf ears. Finally, Churchill got so exasperated at Brooke Popham's pleas that he sacked him on the 5th of November 1941, 1 month before the Japanese invaded. However, they couldn't find a replacement, so Brooke Popham remained in charge until a replacement was found well after the fighting began. In October 1941, the Japanese military made their final preparations for war. Their prime objective was to secure the tin mines of Malaya, shown here in the orange colours, and the rubber plantations of Malaya, shown here in the green, as well as all the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia. To achieve that, they would have to take the impregnable, so-called, fortress of Singapore. And on 30th of November 1941, the commander of Japan's 25th Army, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, was ordered by the Imperial War Cabinet to proceed with the invasion of Singapore. Yamashita's subsequent conquest of the British fortress, fighting his way along the 1,100 kilometres of the Malay Peninsula in only 70 days after his forces landed on the 8th of December 1941, was one of the most brilliant campaigns of modern military history. For this feat, Yamashita earned the nickname the Tiger of Malaya, which was much more complimentary than his previous nickname, the Butcher of Nanking. Yamashita was born in November 1885. He was the second son of a humble country doctor in a farming village in southwest Japan. In 1904, he enrolled at the military academy and graduated 16th of the 920 cadets in December the following year. Later, he graduated from the War College, ranking 6th in his class of 56 officers, and received a sword from the Emperor as a mark of distinguished performance. Captain Yamashita thus became an officer of the elite and was rewarded by a posting to Switzerland and later Germany from 1918 to 1922. A colleague in Germany was Tojo Hideki, later the infamous General Tojo. By 1934, Yamashita was a major general, but his career suffered a major setback when he was implicated in an attempted military coup. The emperor was enraged and Yamashita was sent in disgrace to Korea as a brigade commander. During this leisurely appointment, Yamashita mellowed somewhat and became a devotee of Zen Buddhism. A very large man for a Japanese, at over 180 centimetres or 6 feet tall and weighing 100 kilograms, Yamashita was a good-natured family man who enjoyed an afternoon nap, during which his snoring was renowned in army circles. In 1937, Yamashita's brigade took part in the invasion of China. He led from the front, often exposing himself to enemy fire. However, his men also committed the most dreadful atrocities, most noticeable in the sack of Nanking as it was known then, the Chinese administrative capital, which earned him the nickname the Butcher of Nanking. The cruelty was unbelievable, and there's a book still in print about it if you've got a strong enough stomach to read it. For his distinguished service, Yamashita was eventually rewarded on the 8th of November 1941 with command of the 25th Army, only 3 days after the Japanese cabinet had resolved to go to war against the United States and Britain. The 3 divisions comprising the 25th Army totalled 70,000 men, but Yamashita wanted only 26,000 to be allocated to the invasion of Malaya. He wanted a force that was fast on their feet. They faced a British and colonial garrison that now numbered 140,000 men. Of Yamashita's 26,000, only 17,230 were actually combat-ready troops. However, they were equipped with tanks. The British thought that Malaya was unsuitable for tank warfare, even though they built the most magnificent roads down the west coast. So there were no tanks on the British side. There were plenty, and they were very effectively used by the Japanese. An armada of 27 transports left Sanya on Hainan Island on the 4th of December 1941. The main force, including Yamashita, landed in Thailand, which was a neutral country and therefore undefended, but that didn't concern the Japanese. Yamashita's troops actually ran into a bit of a skirmish with the Thai troops, but it was regarded as a misunderstanding and nothing more. Subsequently, Thailand declared war on Britain and the United States. The Thai ambassador to the US, who was a great-grandson of King Rama II in Washington, was offered the money that America had frozen in Thai bank accounts if he did not deliver the declaration of war. Obviously he didn't, and he became a very rich man. 2 hours before launching their attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the 6 groups landed at Kota Bharu in British Malaya, meeting considerable resistance and sustaining heavy casualties. The British military leaders in Singapore didn't take the Japanese invasion seriously at first. The governor of Singapore, when he was informed of the landings at Kota Bharu, remarked, "Well, I suppose you'll shove the little men off," to the army commander, General Percival. It's a shame that the British didn't warn the Americans of what was happening, because if they had, there would have been time, for example, to get up steam and get the battleships out of Pearl Harbor, where they would be much less of a sitting duck target, and get some aircraft into the air to meet the oncoming Japanese air attack. But it didn't happen. The army commander for the Far East, Lieutenant General Percival, was an unfortunate fellow, perhaps partly because of his personal appearance and habits. He was very tall, very angular, raw-boned, somewhat stooped, and had protruding front teeth and a little moustache. He spoke quietly, probably because he had a lisp, and was the classic caricature of what the English call a hooray Henry. The Australians quickly nicknamed him the Rabbit. In fact, he had seen real action in the Great War, volunteering at the age of 27 in 1914 and participating in almost non-stop action throughout the entire war. Although he never went to the British Military Academy at Sandhurst, by 1922 he had commanded almost every unit in the British Army, from platoon through to brigade. His bravery and his intelligence were unquestioned, and he was deservedly highly decorated. Following his war service, Percival held a whole series of staff positions, in other words, desk jobs, culminating in his attachment to the Chief of Imperial General Staff, the aptly named General Dill. As a result, Percival came to be known as a brilliant staff officer, which is a code word for hopeless in the field but very good with office work. And he went without a command for the next 20 years. Finally, on the 16th of May 1941, Percival was appointed Army Commander to the Far East and shipped out to Singapore. To his credit, he immediately recognised the serious situation that faced Singapore and pulled every favour he could from his old mates in Whitehall to attempt to bolster the garrison. But Churchill dithered, first granting and then cancelling approval for most of Percival's requests. What's more, the great naval base of Singapore lacked a key ingredient. There were no ships. The press photographers had a field day with Percival, constantly publishing pictures that made him out to be a complete buffoon. If ever there was a general condemned by photography, then Percival was it. Percival also had to contend with 3 commanders-in-chief in the space of 3 months. Brooke Popham for the first 3 weeks, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Pownall for a month before he got frightened and ran off to Java with General Wavell, and General Archibald Wavell himself from the 3rd of January 1942, doing things remotely from India, where he was a lot safer. None of these men were any use at all. If anything, their vacillations made Percival's job just that much harder, and he largely had to make things up as he went along. The Singapore governor, Sir Shenton Thomas, also rather fancied himself as a military genius, even though he'd never served in the military, and he continually interfered with Percival's decisions. So the British High Command in the Far East was a complete shambles. Now look at these 2 men. If you were going to lay money on who would win a contest, who would you bet on? And to me, the bloke on the right doesn't look from his body language as though he's brimming with self-confidence. And so leadership is a lot about perception. And if those who are under your command treat you or regard you as a figure of fun and contempt, then you're just going to have an uphill battle to get anything, to achieve anything. You couldn't say that the British were not adequately informed of Japan's intentions in the lead up to the invasion of Malaya, and in fact this is an intelligence report dated the 27th of November 1941, which very accurately, from observation, reports on the build-up of ships in Hainan, the build-up of aircraft, and predicts virtually the hour and the day and the place where the Japanese were going to attack. But unfortunately, it was ignored. Earlier, in mid-August 1941, the Admiralty had finally decided to form a Far Eastern fleet. This was proposed to comprise 7 battleships and the recently modernised battlecruiser HMS Renown. However, the emergence of such a fleet was only deemed possible if the Americans increased their present force of 3 battleships in the Atlantic as a safeguard to convoys against the threat of the German battleship Tirpitz. Furthermore, if and when Britain's Far Eastern Fleet came into being, it was to operate primarily in the Indian Ocean. In August 1941, in support of the choice of ships deemed necessary to fulfil this task, the first Sea Lord, Dudley Pound, stated that there was no use in sending a fleet to Singapore unless it was of sufficient strength to wage effective war against the Imperial Japanese Navy. And he was right there. Pound felt it imperative for any Far Eastern fleet to be based at the more secure location of Trincomalee in Ceylon to offer protection to the vital trade routes. In less than 2 weeks, Churchill issued a long memorandum informing the Admiralty that he wouldn't approve the dispatching of such a large fleet. He deemed it more appropriate to use a small number of the best ships to cope with a superior hostile force. Churchill envisaged these warships serving as an immediate deterrent against Japanese aggression, operating in an area encompassing the triangle of Simonstown, Singapore and Aden, forming a fast raiding squad capable, in his opinion, of inflicting a paralysing effect on the Imperial fleet, comparable to that affected by the Tirpitz on the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. On the 20th of October 1941, Winston Churchill scored a personal victory over his own war cabinet when they finally conceded to his wishes by allowing HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to form the basis of his alleged deterrent squadron in the Indian Ocean. For air cover, they'd be accompanied by the new aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable. Subsequently, in the early afternoon, 25th October 1941, the Prince of Wales, in company with the destroyers Electra, Express and Hesperus, left Greenock Naval Base destined for the Far East. Shortly after she completed her working up trials, unfortunately HMS Indomitable ran aground in the West Indies and sustained so much damage that she had to be withdrawn from service. Obviously, the loss of air cover for the 2 battleships was a disaster, but no one thought, or appeared to have given thought to making use of another carrier, such as HMS Hermes, which was actually putting into Simonstown Naval Base in South Africa at the same time as HMS Prince of Wales was preparing to leave Cape Town just a few miles away. Their next port of call was Colombo, and from here they steamed to a position just south of Ceylon to rendezvous with HMS Repulse. From that point on, the squadron became known by the impressive sounding name Force Z. On the 2nd of December 1941, the force entered the Straits of Johor and docked. They were the first ships ever to dock, warships to dock at Singapore's naval base. The Force Z commander, Admiral Tom Phillips, awaited them. Like Percival, Phillips had spent much of his career as a staff officer and had never had a command before. And it's obvious that he had no clear idea of how he was to use the ships that were now under his command. During the afternoon of the 6th of December, Phillips learnt that 38 Japanese transports, supported by strong naval escorts, had been spotted off the south coast of French Indochina, heading in the direction of the Gulf of Siam. Phillips may not have been the archetypal action man, but he wasted no time in deciding to take his ships on the offensive. Unfortunately for him, because they put no repair facilities into the naval base at Singapore, and the Prince of Wales had one of her boilers blow up, she was incapable of operating at full capacity. Of far more concern was the condition of her ultra-modern surface scanning radar, which was inoperative. Just before 4 a.m. on the morning of 8th of December 1941, that is around 10 a.m. on the 7th of December in Honolulu, 2 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor began, the air raid sirens sounded in Singapore, and the secondary armament of the ships of Force Z opened up on 17 Japanese Betty bombers that were attacking Singapore City from their bases in Indochina. The battle for Singapore had begun. Finally, at 5:35 p.m. on the 8th of December 1941, with all other immediate repairs more or less complete, Prince of Wales and Repulse, in company with their attendant destroyers, now augmented by the Australian destroyer HMAS Vampire, left Singapore Naval Base. Their destination was the reported Japanese troop landings taking place around Singapore in Thailand. Philip's plan was to destroy the beachhead, then retire before the Japanese could gather what would felt to be an overwhelming force. At approximately 1:45 p.m. next day, the Japanese submarine I-65 located them, immediately reporting their position to the Imperial cruiser Ura. Several hours later, at 5 p.m, the sun broke through, quickly clearing heavy skies. Soon after, lookouts aboard Prince of Wales reported 3 sightings of Japanese aircraft. Phillips now realised that the element of surprise was lost, and at dusk he contemplated what course of action to pursue. In the meantime, because of a lack of endurance, the elderly destroyer Tenedos was sent back to Singapore. As it was, at 9 p.m. on December the 9th, Phillips, being fully aware that his ships were now the subject of a detailed Japanese search, sent the following signal to his commanders. I have most regrettably cancelled the operation because, having been located by aircraft, surprise was lost and our target would be almost certain to be gone by the morning and the enemy fully prepared for us. With this, Force Z turned south and headed back towards Singapore. At around midnight, a further Japanese submarine spotted the warships, whereupon it immediately dived and within minutes prepared to launch an attack. Due to a malfunction in one of its torpedo tubes, Repulse and Prince of Wales escaped that particular fate. As I mentioned earlier, following a long tradition, French Indochina had surrendered to the Japanese immediately when asked in 1940 and made its air bases available for Japanese use. Consequently, the air attacks on Singapore and on Force Z were launched from Saigon. At 11 a.m. on the 10th of December 1941, Force Z suffered the most horrific aerial onslaught at the hands of the Japanese war machine. Prince of Wales was steaming at 25 knots when 9 Bettys appeared low on a port bow. In a moment, they'd released their torpedoes. The battleship frantically shifted from the 5-inch secondary armament barrage to small arms rapid fire. The noise was deafening, reaching a crescendo as the planes flew literally within metres of the guardrails. Men on the upper deck watched in horror as the tracks of incoming torpedoes drew ever closer. Suddenly there was a tremendous explosion. Eyewitnesses said the ship appeared to be stopped dead suddenly by the force of this detonation. Many believed the entire battleship had been literally thrown in the air. Within seconds, the Prince of Wales took on a list of 11 degrees. Her speed fell to 15 knots, with both her steering gear and main electrical systems fatally damaged. She could no longer outmanoeuvre with any degree of control. More alarmingly, most of the power supplies to her guns were inoperative. Despite heroic resistance put up by her crew, both battleships were overwhelmed and sank. Phillips was one of 840 officers and men, aforesaid, who lost their lives. It was a sobering lesson for the traditionalists, for it graphically demonstrated that the age of the capital ship had passed. For Singapore, it was an utter disaster. A feeling of dread gripped the Australian government, for without Singapore and the promised naval protection, Australia was defenceless. Even as late as some days after the Japanese landed, Brooke Popham, who was still the British Commander-in-Chief at that stage, hesitated to send troops north in accordance with the Matador plan. When he did finally approve Operation Matador, Brooke Popham then countermanded his own orders and cancelled the operation after it had commenced, which did nothing to improve the morale of his troops. Meanwhile, everything was going according to plan for Yamashita. Since he had not much more than 1/3 of the British Army's strength, he wanted to conquer Singapore in the shortest possible time in order to overcome his numerical disadvantage. I think today they call that strategy shock and awe. Well, he certainly shocked and awed the British. His philosophy was called Kirimoni Sakusen, which roughly means don't stop under any circumstances and don't respond to any fire from behind. Just go, go, go. And they did. He concentrated his forces on the west coast, where the land was flat and the roads were well paved, and made the individual units compete one against the other in their advance. His first objective was to break through the Jitra line and secure intact the bridges at Kuala Kangsa over the 400-metre wide Perak River. It took only 2 battalions, supported by a company of tanks, to break through the Jitra line on the 11th of December. Yamashita had achieved his first objective within 24 hours of the commencement of the battle. Percival realised that he was facing a different kind of adversary, skillful in penetration and dauntless in attack, for whom casualties were not a consideration. Thereafter, lightly armed Japanese soldiers captured Alostar, Benton, Cray, Taiping, all the towns down the peninsula, with their bicycle blitzkrieg that gave them the advantage of enormous speed over the ponderous British. The British panicked and abandoned Penang without resistance before the Japanese even crossed the Channel. Sensing the lack of fighting spirit of the British, Yamashita concluded that they would seek to defend Singapore by making a stand in northern Johor, so he pressed his men ever harder to pursue the now rapidly retreating British forces. The Japanese charged forward with no let-up, and by the last day of January 1942 stood on the end of the causeway at Johor Bahru. On that day, General Percival issued a statement to the citizens of Singapore which stated, "The Battle of Malaya has ended and the Battle of Singapore has begun. Today we are trapped in this fortress. Our duty is to hold the fortress until reinforcements arrive. Of course they will come." Well, they didn't. On the 8th of February, Yamashita launched a series of landings on Singapore, and this is where the naval guns could have absolutely decimated his massed forces on the other side of the Johor Strait, but of course they couldn't turn around. His men poured into Singapore and secured Tengah Aerodrome. I forgot to mention on the way that within 2 days of landing in Thailand, the Japanese Air Force had completely wiped out the entire British Air Force, so they had total command of the air from the whole of the campaign. Within 2 days, the Japanese took control of the water reservoirs at Bukit Timah, and the British were in desperate trouble. Yamashita hoped that the British would surrender the next day, which was the anniversary of the Emperor's accession to the throne of Japan, and he had a surrender appeal dropped from the air. But there was no response, so the Japanese cut off the water supply to the city. On the 15th of February, Percival and his generals unanimously agreed to surrender. Percival and Yamashita met at the Ford car factory at 6:30 p.m. that day. Yamashita had accomplished in 70 days with 3 divisions a brilliant feat that all military experts, including his own, had thought would take 18 months with 5 divisions. It was an amazing victory. As well as vast stores of food and 10,000 vehicles, the Japanese captured huge quantities of ordnance, including 740 artillery pieces. This was most welcome because by the day Percival surrendered, most of the Japanese soldiers were out of ammunition and would have had to defend any counterattack with bayonets only. Their 2 serviceable heavy machine guns had only 20 rounds apiece, enough for a few seconds burst. Out of their initial 17,000 combat troops, the Japanese suffered 14,768 casualties, including 5,240 dead. They captured 130,000 Allied prisoners, half of them from the Indian Army. This next photo is, as you'll note, clearly marked reproduction not permitted. But I feel entitled to show it, as the prisoner on the left of the screen is my Uncle Ivor. Like most of his compatriots, he only survived a few years after liberation, his body giving up after the desperate suffering that had been inflicted by the Japanese. If you take the immediate post-war deaths into account, around 88,000 of the 130,000 captured by the Japanese at Singapore were killed, many of them in the death camps along the Burma Railway. And the deaths amongst the civilian population of Singapore during the battle and the subsequent occupation are uncounted, but must have been well in excess of 200,000. So the total death toll of combatants and non-combatants certainly exceeded 250,000 and probably well over 300,000. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, and a lot's been written about the detail of the battle for Malaya and the battle for Singapore, with much criticism levelled at the handling of individual skirmishes that were parts of the overall battles. But Singapore could not be saved, and the blame rests squarely with successive British governments, whose decisions from 1919 to 1941 built up a chain that inevitably led to disaster. The figure that looms large in each of those key decisions is Churchill, and he, surely more than any other individual, has to bear the lion's share of the blame. Remember, though, that Churchill's prime concern was the preservation of the mother country, and he was prepared to go to any lengths, including the sacrifice of all the colonies and their colonial troops, in order to save England. And he succeeded, and we should be grateful for that. Percival's performance in the brief campaign was far from perfect, but it's difficult to dissent from his own rather wan verdict, delivered in response to a Japanese reporter when he was a prisoner in Changi. "I lost because I never had a chance," and spoke the truth. Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes, unfortunately. I've rabbited on a bit too long. If there are just 1 or 2 questions, I can take them now, but otherwise come and see me afterwards. I'll be sort of folding things up here for a little while, and then I'll be in the Mosaic Cafe. So please feel free to ask any questions you like. The next lecture tomorrow, I'll be talking about Jim Thompson, the Thai Silk King, a CIA agent who came out to Thailand and established Thailand's most famous and rewarding industry, and then disappeared under mysterious circumstances in Malaya at the height of the communist insurgency. Interesting story, interesting fellow. Yes?
After the Allies came and took Singapore back, was there anything that was done for the Japanese who committed all these atrocities?
Not much, really. MacArthur's philosophy was not to rock the boat too much. Some of the figureheads went to trial, including Yamashita, and Yamashita was executed in November 1945. He was hung by MacArthur for the crimes he committed, not in Singapore, Malaysia or China, but they were able to nail him through eyewitness evidence on the atrocities that he and his men committed in Manila when MacArthur landed in the Philippines. Yeah, another? Yes?
Sir, is it true that during Yamashita's advance onto Singapore, because of the lack of morale of the British and Australian troops, they fell back into the city and they themselves committed considerable atrocities?
Yes, there was looting. There were not civilian deaths or beatings or anything like that, but yes, there was some very bad lack of discipline in those troops. I think they felt so disillusioned by the lack of leadership that they'd had. But looting was the extent of it, that's all.
Thank you.
I think we'd better vacate the premises.